Hello, welcome to Prove All Things. It's glad to have everybody out there joining us today, this Tuesday afternoon, noon. We got a great program. Hopefully, we're going to do for you. You can judge that later, whether it is or not. But we're glad you're joining. We look forward to your comments on Facebook, YouTube, and on our website, cgi.online.church. And I'm joined with the co-host Mike James. I'm going to
Hey
bring Mike
Jeff.
James in here. How you doing, Mike?
Good, Jeff. How's it going down there in Atlanta?
It's very cold. Very
Yeah,
cold.
you guys down south are getting winter that we get up north
Hmm.
now.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I was talking to a fella in Texas over in Tyler, and he lost power yesterday. He didn't know if he was going to have it today. So they're getting it worse right now than we have it up here in Maryland.
Wow. Yeah, it was I think it's records. We set a lot of records in 2020 for like heat waves and fires and hurricanes and all kinds of natural disasters happened. It looks like now we're setting records in 2021 because I think
Yeah.
they've never been that cold and they've never had that much snow as far as they know in Texas. I guess in recent history since we've been keeping records.
Yeah, that's very uncommon. I remember visiting a buddy of mine in Dallas a number of times in February, and I was just amazed by the fact it was in the 60s, and it even was 70 one time
Hmm.
when I visited him in February a number of years ago.
Hmm. Yep. And also, we were supposed to have Blake Silverstein join us today from Texas, and he's in Houston. And I believe I don't know how far it is, but I think all of Texas is having power outages because the grid is not able to keep up with the demand because everybody is so cold. I've seen friends posting on Facebook and Fellowship that there's maybe like 35 degrees or 45 degrees in their house, and because they haven't had power
Wow.
for like over a day. So it's
Wow.
definitely
Wow.
some really tough conditions that people are dealing with. And it looks like
Definitely.
a lot of the roads are closed, and I get they got anywhere from 6 to 10 inches of snow or more.
Wow, that's a lot
Hmm.
for Texas, no doubt about it. I don't
Yeah.
know that they can deal with that much longer. Hopefully, it'll that vortex will go back north.
Hmm. How's it? How is it where you're at? Y'all get any
Yeah,
snow there?
here. There's a little bit of snow on the
Hmm.
ground. It's about mid 30s today, actually, mid
Yeah.
30s. So that's not too bad for here. We're actually going to get up to 50 on a couple days, I believe.
Hmm.
So then it'll drop back into the 30s. But usually in February, it's not too bad here. But the last couple weeks have been the worst part of the winter for us.
Hmm. All right. So on today's show, we were going to have Blake Silverstein from CEM, but he's in Houston and he doesn't have power, so it's really hard to do a connection with someone without power. But we look forward to bringing Blake in next week. Hopefully, things will have recovered by then. We don't know the way things are going, but we guess in a week from now, Texas should be okay. We are praying that their power and maybe things are close to normal, so we can bring him in. And we have
Yeah,
a lot of people in
I
Texas we
think
want to bring into the show. So,
Right, right. I've talked to some of the elders down
mhm.
there that'll be joining us. Win Skelton, John Reedy. I've already got them connected with some ideas for the program, and they'll be joining us in the coming weeks. And I think Bill Watson will
Mhm.
be joining us in a couple weeks from now. So yeah, we're going to get a lot of guest folk speakers on the program, and they'll be joining us for various segments.
Mhm. All right. So what I wanted to look at as part of the program is I wanted to go into this subject of media bias because we hear about media bias all the time, and generally we even hear the media talk about media bias when they're talking about their competitors or others, and so we're all aware of this media bias. And I guess what happens if you're a left-leaning person, you tend to get your news from left-leaning sources. And if you're right-leaning, maybe you tend to get your sources, maybe perhaps you get your news from right-leaning sources. And sometimes, if that's all you look at, you may not get the full picture of what's going on in the world and miss some very important news stories that are out there. And so it's important to understand, I guess, media bias, especially would prove all things, that we're taking a skeptical look at all things, and we want to look at the Bible. We want to look how Christians are covered, and in the world, and we will maybe look at prophecy and how things are moving and shaking, as you say, in the world, and towards what we know about Bible prophecy. So to do those kind of things, we got to really look for the real facts and not let some things maybe cloud our judgment.
Definitely, Jeff. I just one quick vignette about that. I remember a number of years ago, there was a big news story, and I checked out Fox News and how they were reporting on it. Then I looked at CNN and I caught some of what they were saying about the same story. Then I looked at MSNBC and I saw what they were saying about the same story. And what I found, Jeff, was there were some facts that were not given by all three of
Mm-hmm.
those major network news sources.
Mm-hmm.
And it showed me that they were skewing the story to fit their narrative.
Mm-hmm.
But in looking at all three of them, I saw angles on the same story
Mm-hmm.
that I did not get from one source. I did not get from a second. But by looking at all three, I got a fuller view of the story, which gave me a better way to think about the story than if I was just watching one source or the other.
Mm-hmm.
So you're making a very good point there. And we need to do the same thing when we study the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
You know, there are conservative scholars out there, liberal scholars, people in the middle. And we need to remember that who is this person we're getting the information
Mm-hmm.
from? That will also help us in trying to determine what the truth is.
Yeah, and there's a lot of bad information out there from all sources, from religious sources, news, just whatever. And maybe we'll look at biased and religious sources one day. There's a couple of websites they track media bias, and I probably think that they may have some bias of their own, because I don't. It's really hard to completely remove yourself from bias, because I know I'm biased, and so if you're watching the show, you're going to get probably my biases will come through, even though as hard as I try to say we're going to be right in the middle, and we're going to look at evidence. We have our own biases that we're probably even not aware of, so we have to be aware of those things. So one of the sites is called All Sides, and they have a media bias chart, and I have it right here. You can kind of see it. You can look it up on their site, and it kind of puts a lot of the news and where they fall on the spectrum from left or right. So, like on the left, you have news sources like Alternet, BuzzFeed News, CNN Opinion, the Daily Beast, the Huffington Post, Mother Jones, MSNBC. That's the regular news. Newsweek, New Yorker, New York Times, their opinions, and Slate and Vox. And so we're probably familiar with those. I probably even looked at those sources for news and found some information in there. But they would, like, say, for instance, CNN, their opinion is heavily to the left when they report things. And what CNN does is that they have a thing called analysis that you'll read on their website. Say this is analysis of something, but it's really just opinion. It's just another word for opinion, because most of their analysis falls on a left view when they look at different subjects. Now, so that's far left on the news sources, and some of them's news. It's not even their opinion; it's just their news are far left. Especially like Huffington Post, Mother Jones, Vox. Now, when it comes to like the New York Times and CNN, their news, they still rank those left. That they're not center, but they're kind of left when they just report news and how they cover headlines or what news they choose to report on. And that also falls like ABC, it says CBS, NBC, NPR, their opinions, Politico, Time, the Washington Post, and Yahoo News is and what this site does, and the other media bias fact check is they go and they look for examples of bias, and they just rank them and they put them together and they just keep a track of it, and then just kind of rank and see how do these reporting go against fact and how are they reporting it from these biases. And so this right here kind of gives you a bias. Now on the right, let me go to the center. The center, they have like the Associated Press. Now I would bet that there's some people on the right who look at the Associated Press and say they're liberal because I'm right of the Associated Press. And I know people who are liberal who look at the Associated Press and say they're too right biased because they try to do things, they give Republicans a voice or something. So there's, from based upon what they've looked at, they rate the AP as trying to in the middle, that they have nothing really showing as that. And then they have the BBC, Christian Science Monitor, Real Clear Politics, The Hill, USA Today, and the Wall Street Journal. They're news only because they do have opinion. And I think the Wall Street Journal opinion that tends towards the right as well. And so on the right, you have Fox News. Their news only is just kind of a little bit right. With Newsmax, their news a little bit right. New York Post a little bit right. And then their opinions, Fox News opinion, just like CNN opinion is on the left, Fox News opinion is on the right, on the far right. And you have National Review, The Federalist, Newsmax, Blaze, CBN, Daily Caller, American Spectator, Breitbart. Again, all sources of news. And again, you can get news from all these sources. And some of these news stories are good stories, but you have to realize there's a bias associated with these things.
Yeah, no doubt about it, Jeff. That's a good overview there. And when you look at who funds some of these news sources, that also gives you a little more information about why they may be slanting things a certain way. I remember years ago, the Unification Church, we know them as the Moonies, they were funding and they owned the Washington Times, which is a conservative newspaper in Washington, D.C. Of course, the Washington Post is known as the more liberal newspaper in Washington, D.C. You have the Epic Times today, which is funded and created by a group called Falun Gong. And you'll notice that they report a lot about China because Falun Gong has been outlawed in China. So that's why they do a lot of reporting on China and give you that particular angle on things. And again, when you think
they're
about
very critical of China.
Yeah, definitely. There are some things to be critical of China about, no doubt about it.
Yes.
But it's good to know that why do they put so much emphasis on China? That's part of the reason, because of the fact that their Buddhist organization has been outlawed in China. So again, when you look at the sourcing of some of these papers, some of these news magazines, some of these shows that are on the internet. I remember, was it called InfoWars with Alex Jones?
Yeah.
Which was very popular a few years ago.
I mean, he was removed from a lot of apps and from YouTube and stuff. Alex Jones is considered to be in the conspiracy column of right, and a lot of things he says are not provable by facts. It's just based upon a lot of his opinions and conspiracies that he has.
Exactly, and that's what we got to be careful of. Most importantly, is those internet shows.
Yes.
We talk about the mainstream media and the biases they do have, which they do have, but at least they've got people who've gone to school to learn about journalism and what sourcing is, and they put their names to their articles that they write. And you know who these people are that are reporting, so we can go to the source there. But when you've got shows like Alex Jones, whose sources are just out there on the net, he's grabbing things that are out there willy-nilly and then bringing them to you. Some of it is legitimate, no doubt about it. Yeah, but some of it is just ridiculous. It's baloney. And we need to be careful of that, and we need to be cautious when we get things off of the internet.
Yeah, and so sometimes we go to like the Wikipedia for sources, And again, I like the Wikipedia. It provides really good sources for religious topics, and gives you like links to where you can find more information. And but when it comes to the Wikipedia, a lot of the people who are editors for it, and Wikipedia is a nonprofit organization where people out there just edit. They don't do the editing themselves, but the people out there edit, and a lot of the editors have a left bias. And what I mean by that is it's really subtle in some ways. Like for example, I'm going to read you the description of CNN from the Wikipedia, and then we'll read you the description of Fox News from the Wikipedia. And both of these are, CNN is definitely on the far left, and Fox News is on the far right. Those are, that's where they follow their news, and their straight news is leaning left and leaning right, but their opinions are definitely right and left. So CNN, it says, cable news network is a multinational news-based pay television channel headquartered in Atlanta. It is owned by CNN Worldwide, a unit of Warner Media News and Sports division of AT&T's Warner Media. So that's how they describe CNN in their first sentence. Fox News, it says, Fox News, officially Fox News Channel, abbreviated FNC, and commonly known as Fox, is an American multinational conservative cable news television channel based in New York City. Now, again, that's true. They are a conservative channel, but they're not listing CNN as a liberal channel. And that's where you get that bias in there. Because CNN also tries to present itself as straight news and that they aren't biased. And their commentators who appear on the evening news will, with a straight face, be left-wing opinions, left-wing commentary, and say, we're giving you straight news. And that's where you have to see that there's a little deceptive in how they're portrayed. So we do have that bias out there.
Yeah, I think when you look at especially the evening programs on CNN and Fox, when you
Mm-hmm.
got your Anderson Cooper on one side and your what's the fella's name on Fox,
Tucker Carlson?
Tucker
Yes.
Carlson. So
Mm-hmm.
they're both at 8 o'clock,
Mm-hmm.
and when you listen to one and you listen to the other, you definitely see the fact that they're bringing in the
Mm-hmm.
right side bias or the left side
Mm-hmm.
bias. There's no doubt about it. And then you go to the 9 o'clock program, the 10 o'clock program,
Yeah.
and it's the same thing, especially with those evening programs. It's more opinion
Mm-hmm.
on the news rather than straight news. And you will get that even throughout the day,
Mm-hmm.
but more so in the evening on those particular programs when a
Yeah.
lot of people are watching TV is where they're trying to grab
Yeah.
that audience and keep them in.
And also, to be fair, CNN claims that their news that they have in the evening is not opinion. They claim that's just news. But anybody can look at it and see that this is definitely opinionated people who are no different from what Fox labels as opinion. So it's very interesting that you have that, and we shouldn't be fooled by that or think that that's straight news.
Definitely,
Kind of thing.
definitely. I can vouch for that. I've seen enough of it to
Hmm.
agree with you on that one,
Yeah.
Jeff.
And again, Media Bias Fact Check is another site where they go and they look and they see if they can find the bias in these things. So I'm gonna look a little bit at what they write about CNN, because again, CNN portrays itself as down the middle, but what do people outside look at it as? And it says overall, we rate CNN left biased based on editorial positions that consistently favors the left, while straight news reporting falls left center through bias by omission. We also rate them mixed for factual reporting due to several failed fact checks by TV hosts. However, news reporting on the website tends to be properly sourced with minimal failed fact checks. So online, you might get some more sourced articles that you can actually find that these are real things they're talking about. But a lot of the opinion people will just say things without fact checking it, because that's what happens with opinion pieces. It's more like, what do I think about this?
Definitely, definitely. The editorial page,
Mm-hmm.
in the major newspapers, you'll notice. I said that the Washington Post was liberal,
Mm-hmm.
and most of the time I look at the editorial page every day in there, and it's true. Most of the time, those editorials are leaning left, but they do. I have to admit,
Mm-hmm.
I've got to be honest now. The Washington Post will bring in a conservative from time to time to write an editorial piece within the Washington Post. So again, when we hear people putting the Washington Post in the liberal side, or we hear people putting the Wall Street Journal on the conservative side, there are articles that you will
Mm-hmm.
find that will focus on the conservative views in the Washington Post. There are articles in the Wall Street Journal that will focus on liberal ideas within the Wall Street Journal. So at least they're trying to put in a little bit of sprinkling a little of the other
Mm-hmm.
side in
Yeah.
there, but you can definitely see where they lean if you're reading these things on a regular basis.
Yeah. I'm going to go and read what it says here. It says CNN typically uses loaded emotional words in sensational headlines, such as this: Trump pounces on Justice Department report findings. They usually source their news properly through credible reporters and through hyperlinking to credible media sources. However, CNN has failed several fact checks from PolitiFact, and it should be noted that these fact checks were almost exclusively from guests on their programs. And further, CNN has retracted published stories that they've been deemed as lacking evidence. And finally, CNN has published misleading information regarding GMOs that utilize loaded fear-based headlines, such as this: FDA allows genetically engineered Frankenfish salmon to be imported to the U.S. And there's a thing with science headlines and health headlines. And if you ask a scientist or ask a doctor to really look at them, they're very sensational, always looking to get that click in how they're
Yeah.
worded.
I found a good one a few years ago, Jeff, in the Washington Post, where there were some new find that biologists had found some type of a missing link, and the title of the article gave you the impression that what had been found was a major item in regard to evolutionary theory. But when you read the article, Jeff,
Mm-hmm.
it did not live up to what the title of the article said, because it said the opinion of the biologist is this, and he
Mm-hmm.
thinks this about the find, but there were other biologists who disagreed with the guy.
Mm-hmm.
So we got to be very careful with those titles and with those items we see
Mm-hmm.
when we're going through Yahoo News or Apple News or whatever news it is. They're trying to grab your attention
Mm-hmm.
and pull you in. I had a guy recently tell me about an article that was written in either Time or Newsweek, and he was trying to say that it was saying this or that, and I asked him, did you read the article?
Mm-hmm.
He admitted to me he hadn't read the article, and I said there's a lot of comments right now about that article that the title is not living up to the expectations when you read the actual article. So yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, and I guess with those kind of things, there'll be a headline, like for instance, and like with the vaccines that are now out, you'll see a lot of vaccine headlines. And again, I'm not a doctor. I'm not giving any my advice on vaccines. I'm just saying there's headlines that will say that this person died like shortly after receiving a vaccine, or this person died 2 weeks later. And I was like, wow, that's awful. And I'll read the story, and they're like, well, there's nothing related or something, and there's no. So it's, in other words, they're just sensationalizing it. But then when you look at the facts, they haven't even found any facts yet. And again,
Exactly.
so again, we
I
want to
think
see like what are the facts behind the article, behind the headlines.
that's a great example. I
Mm-hmm.
think Hank Aaron died maybe a couple weeks after
Mm-hmm.
receiving the vaccine. Again, I got Hank Aaron baseball cards. I remember him as a kid.
Mm-hmm.
But Hank Aaron was also 86 years old. And when you've got millions and millions of people taking a vaccine, we need to be careful before we decide what
Mm-hmm.
has caused the death of someone just because they've had a vaccine. When you get 50 million people taking a vaccine, I mean, some of those people are going to die in a few weeks. It's
Mm-hmm.
just the
Yeah.
law of averages.
Yeah, because that's 1 out of every 7 people, and people die all the time. So yeah, is it related or not related? Because a lot of people will brush their
Yeah,
teeth, and then an hour later have a heart attack. Some people will brush their teeth and have a heart attack while they're brushing their teeth. Are we going to blame the toothpaste on the heart attack? So you got to separate and see what is actual the facts involved. And again, if there's facts, I want to see them and I want them to report them. But again, the reporting is always very sensational, especially the headlines. And you get into it, it's just one guy who believes there's this alien. We were visited by aliens a couple of years ago by this comet that was, and this was a scientist, and he wrote a book. And so that's the article is like, scientist says aliens exist or whatever, and you read it and like, well, it's just his theory, and he doesn't really have any evidence other than what he's thinking in his head in the book he wrote. So
Good point, Jeff. One
those
other
things.
point I would make about that is we need to take our time. We
Hmm.
need to take our time when we read a story and not jump to conclusions. When we get new information, hey, let's take a look at it, say, hey, that's possible, but don't come to any conclusions yet, because believe me, more information is going to come out in the coming weeks on that particular story. And let's wait till we get more information before we jump to
Hmm.
conclusions and start emailing this story to everyone and telling them that we think that it's saying this.
Yeah.
We need to calm down a little bit on some of that stuff.
Yeah. Again, I don't want to make judgments on others and what they do, but for myself, I don't want to spread anything that's bad information. I don't want to be like unknowingly, breaking God's law and spreading false information and bearing false witness. So I'm very careful, and I probably have done it. And if somebody points it out to me, I will definitely like say I'm sorry. Just like retracting a news article, because we got to be careful with those things.
Yeah,
One
yeah.
last thing I was going to look at is, so we looked at the left leaning, and you mentioned earlier the Epic Times, and I get an email from the Epic Times like 7 or 8 times a day. They're a new news source. They don't have actual journalists working. They have like people who they're trained in journalism that I know of. Is mostly just people who work for them, and they just kind of practice their own type of journalism. But the Epic Times has a rating also on media bias, and it says overall, we rate the Epic Times as right biased, and they also rate it as questionable, based on the publication of pseudoscience and the promotion of propaganda and conspiracy theories, as well as numerous failed fact checks. And so they give reason they say this. It says editorially, there's been a very strong pro-Trump bias. With all, so we're seeing it as a very negative Trump bias. All their articles are like just they praise Trump in the articles. We're uh, like Democratic Party, a broken kaleidoscope would be a title, or 5 reasons Trump's celebration of America was epic display of patriotism. So definitely that sounds very biased than a straight news source. And that they also, the news source has spent $1.5 million to support the Trump campaign, and so they were actually supporting the campaign with money. So this was, the news source was supportive of that. And so you can see that there is definitely that bias that's there, and that they also, again, they publish some things that are linked to like QAnon conspiracy in their editorial sections, and Spygate, and some other things that are not really well sourced. It's more or less it's opinion pieces and people speculating about things. So again, they do have probably good news, and I've read news off there that's good news because it's fact based and it's sourced, but there is that mix. And I think what also, when you look at all these things, and also when it comes to like religious things, is that Satan likes to give us truth mixed with lies. Because if you believe this little bit of truth here, then you'll accept all these lies. And so it's a way to be deceptive. I want to look at Isaiah 5 in just a couple of verses. In Isaiah 5, speaking of God's people, and I do believe us in the United States, we are God's people, uh, and we can go into that later why I would think that. But again, I believe we're God's people. It says, "Therefore, my people have gone into captivity," and this is not speaking necessarily about us, but speaking about Israel at the time. But I guess it does relate to us in a sense, because they have no knowledge. Their honorable men are famished, and their multitude dried up with thirst. So he's saying that Israel at that time had no knowledge, and because they had no knowledge, they were dried up with thirst. It was a lack of knowledge that was really behind Israel's decline, knowledge of God's laws. And verse 14 is really interesting. It says, "Therefore Sheol has enlarged itself and opened its mouth beyond measure, their glory and their multitude and their pomp, and he who is jubilant shall descend into it." So it's saying Sheol, which is the word for the grave, the grave, and maybe some places is interpreted hell. So, but where people are buried is getting larger because they believe in misinformation, because of this. They're not obeying God's laws, which lead to life. And I think that's kind of like what's going on in our country. I mean, I looked at the news, and I've checked this from different sources, that last year we had an additional 500,000 people die in our country than the previous year, where maybe I think we had 1.8 million people died in 2019, and we had 2.2, 2.3 million people who died because of the virus and other factors in our country, and that's terrible for our country, the most powerful country in the world, because I think we have so much animosity on the sides, and people aren't willing to work together, and there's a lot of chaos, and we've lost a lot of people, and I think that goes directly to God's laws and not obeying God's laws and how it affects our society.
Yeah, I think we can draw some parallels to ancient Israel, no doubt about it, Jeff. When
Mm-hmm.
I wrote a blog, it's called Political Upheaval, a couple of the more recent blogs, if you go on our website. And what I get into in that article is the history of ancient Israel when you get to the zenith of Israel. So when they were at their height of power and prestige in the Middle East, with David's reign and Solomon's reign, what happened soon after that was they just started to go downhill. We have the northern kingdom breaking apart, and you've got the 10 nations in Israel, known as Israel, in the northern part of the Middle East, and then the southern kingdom with the final two tribes there. And soon after that, the Assyrians came in and destroyed the northern kingdom. And then a couple hundred years after that, the Babylonians come in and destroy the southern kingdom. So, God allowed them to go back and forth in their waxing and waning in obedience to
Mm-hmm.
him. But there came a time when he finally stepped in and just put an end to it. And what's interesting about that timing was it was soon after they had reached their height of power and prestige. And no doubt about it, the United States is at its height of power and prestige, at its zenith. And there's a lot of talk in the world today that China, because of its large population, technological capability, that it might be that superpower that could take over
Mm-hmm.
that position in the world from the United States. And so we're going to have to wait and see how things play out.
Yeah, I think the United States, we have a lot of moral problems. We have a lot of problems that relate directly to disobedience to God's law. In that same chapter in Isaiah, verse 20 says, "Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who put darkness for light and light for darkness, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter." So that's what we see. We see, and I could give you examples of where now something that used to be considered evil is now considered good. And if you disagree with that, you're now evil because you disagree with that. And that's more and more, not necessarily in our laws, but a lot of corporations who have a lot of power over people as far as like social media accounts and websites and stuff. If you don't align with what they believe is good, even though it doesn't align with the Bible, they are taking actions against people. It's
We're
definitely
seeing that
interesting.
more and more today, aren't we?
Yeah. So it's just things to keep in mind. All right. So that's all I have for that. You have anything else to add?
No, I think that about covers it. But that's a topic that is so newsworthy
Hmm.
today that we'll probably revisit that
Yeah.
and maybe get some comments from some of the other elders over time on that
Right.
same topic.
Hmm. All right. So we had a question that came in on our website, I think, that
Yeah,
you're
yeah,
gonna answer or attempt to answer.
yeah. Do you have that question, or do you want me to just go into it?
Can you read it, or do you have the question?
You know what? I don't have the question, but I do recall what it said.
Okay. All right.
And what the individual was commenting about was they're aware of our belief that when we die, that we are asleep. We're not conscious. We're waiting for a resurrection, whether that's a resurrection at the time of Christ's second coming or a resurrection at the end of the 1,000-year kingdom of God on earth. That's what we teach and preach and write about in our booklets and pamphlets. So this individual said he was pointing out the parable of Lazarus and the rich man, which is found in Luke chapter 16, specifically Luke 16, verses 19 through about 31. And he said, how can you say that people are unconscious or asleep when the parable of Lazarus and the rich man says that when the Lazarus died and when the rich man died, that they were both aware of things going on. And what he mentioned was that the rich man said, "Can you dip your finger in some water and come and drop it on my tongue because I'm feeling the pain of these flames that I'm engulfed in." So he was using that to support the idea that people are alive and conscious when they die. But here's my question to him, and I wrote this back. I said, if you dip your finger in some water and you put it on somebody's tongue who's engulfed in flames, is that going to take care of alleviating the pain of the flames? And of course it's not, because it is a parable. It's a story that's trying to get at a deeper spiritual meaning. And I did a lot of research on this subject, Jeff, and what you will find is the ancient Jewish leaders and teachers, the rabbis, the Pharisees that Jesus got entangled in debates with, they had many stories that were similar to this story of Lazarus and the rich man. There's a lot of information you can find if you do some research on this subject. And there are stories about people who die and then they get involved in a conversation. And the point of the story isn't to address what the state of the dead is. The point of the story is to relate a bigger spiritual meaning that is found within the story. Because we know that even in the first century of Christian thinking, there was an influence of Hellenistic thought within Judaism at that time. So the Greek belief in life after death that came from the Greek philosophers like Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, they all were around before we get to the first century Christian church. Those influences that they had permeated the entire Roman world. So even the Jewish thinkers and rabbis were influenced by this Greek pagan thought that there was a conscious life after death. And we know that Jesus did not believe in that. What he was doing in the parable of Lazarus and the rich man, he was trying to inform the Pharisees that they couldn't rely on their power and prestige. They had the Moses and the prophets speaking to them in the written scriptures that they had, but they weren't listening to those scriptures. And that's a very apparent when you read that what Jesus says in the parable of Lazarus and the rich man. He says this, he says, even if someone came back from the dead, that it would not affect the brothers of this rich man, because they should be listening to what Moses and the prophets are saying. And I point that out. Why would Jesus mention that someone coming back from the dead would not even affect these people? And this has something to do with the fact that people who argue that the parable of Lazarus and the rich man is not a parable, one of the reasons they give, Jeff, is they say that Lazarus is named in the parable, and that most of the other parables of Jesus don't name an individual. But why would he name this individual Lazarus? And let me read you something. It's over here in John chapter 11. And in John chapter 11, this is where we read about Lazarus being raised from the dead. Now, notice what happens after Lazarus is raised from the dead. I'm going to be reading in John 11 and verse 45. It says this, therefore, many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did put their faith in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. Then the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting of the Sanhedrin, that was the religious authority, What are we accomplishing? They asked. Here is this man performing many miraculous signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and then the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. So, what Jesus is doing in the parable of Lazarus and the rich man, I believe the reason he's naming this man Lazarus is he's striking back at the Pharisees who were trying to kill him because they thought he was going to take away their power and their prestige. And if you read Luke 14, Luke 15, what comes before Luke 16, where we get the parable of Lazarus and the rich man, Jesus is confronting the Pharisees in all of those chapters. He's talking to sinners and tax collectors who the Pharisees look down upon. And in many of those parables that he's relating in Luke 14, 15, and even 16, he's talking about people who were lowly, people who were looked down upon by society, whether it was a poor beggar, whether it was a crippled person, whatever it may be. The Pharisees had this feeling of superiority, many of them, as they looked down upon the rest of society. And Jesus is using these stories to speak against the Pharisees. And that's what you're getting in Lazarus and the rich man also.
Yeah, very interesting. I've also read in a commentary when I was doing a sermon about this subject that there, at least from this commentary, that they had found some sources that this was a story that was widely told back then, that he was basing it on an already existing parable, but the original parable had the roles reversed. Have you heard of that information?
Yes, Jeff. I actually had information that let me read you a quote.
Okay.
It says, in this parable, Jesus is using a familiar folk tale and adapting it to a new purpose. The story of the wicked rich man seems to have come originally from Egypt and was popular among Jewish teachers. The picture of the fate in store for the good and the evil after death is also drawn from traditional Jewish sources. Another quote that I've got is the general motif of this story found its way into Jewish lore, and it is attested in some 7 versions. And that's coming from a book called The Gospel of Luke by I.H. Marshall. And the previous quote was a book called St. Luke by G.B. Card. So it's connecting to what you're saying, Jeff. There were different stories out there, and they used familiar stories and maybe reworked them to give a spiritual point or a lesson to people. One other interesting thing, Jeff, is when you look at what the Bible says about parables. Let me read to you what Matthew 13, verses 34 and 35 say about the use of parables in the Bible. Jesus spoke all these things to the crowd in parables. He did not say anything to them without using a parable. So was fulfilled what was spoken through the prophet. I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter things hidden since the creation of the world. Now, notice this in Matthew 13, verses 10 through 13, a little bit more about the use of parables. The disciples came to him and asked, "Why do you speak to people in parables?" He replied, "Because the knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of heaven has been given to you, but not to them. Whoever has will be given more, and they will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what they have will be taken from them. This is why I speak to them in parables. Though seeing, they do not see. Though hearing, they do not hear or understand." And this is so relevant when you think about the story of Lazarus and the rich
Hmm.
man, because most people, most Christians say that's talking about the state of the dead.
Hmm.
But when you do the research, you'll find out that's not what the state of the dead is.
Hmm.
Jesus was railing against the Pharisees through that parable,
Hmm.
and kind of putting a knife in them a little bit because of the mistakes they were making in teaching the people and working with the people that they had religious authority
Hmm.
over.
Yeah, I think it's like using a common story to give a meaning or something, or tell something about it. I know there's a guy at some feast. His name slips my mind, but we'll talk about Star Wars and how it relates to the gospel. Again, he doesn't believe Star Wars is true. There's no force. There's none of that. But you can use that as a way of teaching people about something that is true. And I think Christ's disciples would have understood. They would have understood what the real state of the dead is. Based on being around him so long and understanding what the scriptures say. I'm sure the Pharisees. It's just this was just a story, and he was using this story to make a point, a very good point.
Yeah, no doubt about it, Jeff. And you
Oh,
see
it's
this
it's
in,
Michael Deering. Michael Deering is the one who
okay.
uses the Star Wars as his parable, so to speak.
Right, the force being like the Holy Spirit in a sense, giving
Hmm.
you this power. And you're right on, Jeff, because there are stories in the Bible itself that we don't take literally.
Hmm.
There's a story of trees talking and deciding who was going to rule over them.
Hmm.
We know that trees don't talk.
Hmm.
There's a story in Isaiah where it's talking about trees talking once again. And in the next verse, it talks about someone dying and going to Sheol, and that all the people who are in Sheol are acknowledging that he's fallen into Sheol just like them. But we know that in Sheol, the Jews believed you were unconscious, you were not
Hmm.
aware. There are numerous scriptures in the Old Testament that tell us that. But the writer in Isaiah was using personification, where he was saying the trees spoke and said this, just like the dead spoke and said that in the very next verse. So you can't equate the fact that he's using personification, talking about the dead, recognizing this figure coming into the place of the dead, because the trees in the very previous scripture were also talking, and we know trees cannot literally talk. So it's just using the vehicle of personification.
Yeah.
One other major point I wanted to make about this, Jeff, is people will make this argument. They'll say, well, why would Jesus use a story that goes against what he actually teaches about the state of the dead? But here's an
And
answer to
that's a
that.
good question. That's a
That
very
is a
good
good
question.
question. I always had trouble with
Yeah.
that. But here's the answer to that question. In the previous parable to Lazarus and the rich man in Luke 16, beginning in verse 1, you get the story of the unjust steward. And I don't know if you remember that parable, Jeff,
Hmm.
but what happens in the parable of the unjust steward is this fellow who's working for a manager. The manager wants him to collect the money that is owed to him by these debtors that he has. So, what does the collector do? He thinks that the manager is going to fire him because he's not doing his job very well.
Hmm.
So, he tells the debtors, hey, you owe me $1,000, only give me 700. You owe me 500 bucks, only give me 300. So then he collects this money and gives it to his boss, and his boss says, oh, you did a good job. But he's being sarcastic, okay? He didn't really do a good job for the boss. What he did was, by becoming friendly with these debtors
Hmm.
and not taking all the money that was owed to his overseer, to his
Hmm.
boss, he now had friends who were going to take care of him when his boss fired him for not doing a good job.
Yeah.
So Jesus isn't saying that you should gyp your people who owe you money, that you should collect less money from
Mhm.
them. That goes against biblical principles.
Especially
If
if you're
you owe
working for someone and they want you to
exactly,
collect all the money. Yeah,
exactly,
yeah.
exactly. So this guy, he had this money owed to him,
Hmm.
but the boss realizes that the reason the unjust steward did that was he knew he was going to be fired,
Hmm.
and now he had some friends who would take care of him once he was fired by
Hmm.
this guy.
Yeah.
So Jesus is not saying you should get involved in nefarious business practices,
Hmm.
okay? Yet he used that story to make the bigger spiritual point,
Hmm.
just like Jesus uses a story that the Pharisees were very familiar with to actually take a jab at the Pharisees within the story.
Hmm. All right, so you have a Bible study coming up this Friday that talks about the state of the dead, right? You've been working on this for
Yeah,
several months.
it's an ongoing series. We do it Fridays, like every couple weeks. I do one, and then Cecil Green, our elder from Oklahoma City, he's doing a series on the kingdom of God from Genesis to Revelation. But my series is called "Where Are the Dead," and we're actually going to get into even more details about Lazarus and the rich man in an upcoming segment. But this weekend on Friday night at 8:30 p.m., we'll be live on our network
Hmm.
here.
Hmm.
At 8:30 p.m., I'll be getting into the story of the Witch of Endor, because that's another
Yes.
story that people
Hmm.
think is saying that the dead are aware and awake,
Hmm.
where we're going to show you that is not the case. We're going to
Hmm.
delve into that story very deeply, get a lot
Hmm.
of details about it out. And I think once we're done talking about it, everyone will agree that the prophet Samuel was not coming up out of the grave to talk to King Saul. It was a demonic force that came up out of the grave to talk to King Saul. And I'll explain why
Hmm.
I'm making that assertion.
So that sounds very interesting. So they can join you and be a part of it on your go to meeting,
Yes,
or they can just join us and watch on the CGI Digital Network this
yes.
Friday at 8:30.
Exactly. My email is mhjames6043 at yahoo.com. You can find it on our website under U.S. churches. Go
Hmm.
to Maryland and you can get my email there. If you send me an email, I will send you a link to the study so you can participate with us by asking questions and giving comments, or you can watch us through Facebook, through Roku, and all those other vehicles that Jeff can tell you about.
All right. Well, thank you, Mike. I think we're coming to the end of today's program.
Wow, that hour went fast,
It goes
Jeff.
by quick. I mean, at some point we may have to make it longer, especially when we get Bill joining us
Yeah,
here. Yeah,
yeah, we got
there's a lot
three.
to talk about.
Okay.
But right now we're 1 hour, and it's going to end soon. And if you're watching on the CGI Digital Network, there's programming to follow that we have 24 hours, or you can watch on demand just like you do Netflix. We have so many Bible studies and sermons and things that you can catch that can help you study and learn God's Word. So thank you all for joining us on Prove All Things, and we'll see you again next week. Goodbye.
Goodbye, everybody.